A lot of people recoil at the word holiness. Perhaps you did just now. The reason is, one reason is because different people understand the word holiness to mean different things. And a lot of them are misunderstandings. For one instance, when people hear the word holiness, they think that person wants me to follow their rules. This is that kind of holiness that smacks of legalism. You know it when you run into it. They're happy to let you know the standard, and even more happy to let you know when you don't live up to the standard. You didn't know the rules before, but you do now, because you've broken them, and they let you know. It's that kind of holiness that makes a lot of us recoil when people assume that to be holy is to, meet my expectations of you. Another misunderstanding of holiness is the one that says, that doesn't have much to do with me. God is holy, and He's infinite and glorious, and I'm a mere mortal human and not infinite, and so God is holy, but I can't be holy. That sentiment was actually spoken to me by a member of a church I served once. He'd be fine with me telling you the story. He's on board now. But that was the sentiment. It's just a category confusion. God is holy, I'm not holy. And so the trouble when we recoil at the language of holiness, or when we assume that it's not about us, it's about God, the problem with that is all the way through the Bible, start to finish, Old Testament, New Testament, holiness is held out as God's intent for His people. What does God want? He wants a holy people. What is He out to do? He's out to save a people for Himself and make them holy. Story of holiness starts in Exodus. God calls Moses, says, Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh. I want you to go in there and tell him to let my people go. He's not going to do it, but you're going to have to be persistent. You'll persevere. I'm going to do some stuff that's going to be persuasive, and then you'll bring my people out. And all of that happens. The people get out in the wilderness after they've been saved from slavery, and God brings Moses up on a mountain and says, I want my people to be two things. We talk about this often. Things you talk about often are things you should remember because they're important. I want them to be a priestly kingdom, and what kind of nation? A holy nation. Now the people are thinking, that's great. What does that mean? And God says, I'm glad you asked. I'll explain it to you. Read Leviticus. And so by the time you get to Leviticus chapter 19, you get this entire text of the Bible, often called the Holiness Code, which sounds scary, but it's not so much. Because the Holiness Code is filled with God saying, you shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy, which, by the way, debunks that second mistake we were talking about. It's not as if this is about God and not about us. God says, the very fact that this describes me means I want to offer it to you. And it means, Leviticus 19, honor your parents. Don't rip off the people who work for you. That's my translation, but that's what it says. Don't trip blind people, and don't talk bad about deaf people. None of that seems particularly legalistic, does it? Look out for the vulnerable. Don't take advantage of them. Offer yourself in love. That's what that holiness code is about. God says, that's what I'm like. I'm holy, the Lord your God, so you must be holy too. When you harvest your crops, leave some on the edge for the folks who are making their way through your town. So they'll have a little something for their journey. That's how I treat you after all. Now, lest we think holiness is an Old Testament idea that doesn't make its way into the New Testament church, we find that the language shows up all over the New Testament too. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3, the Apostle Paul says to the Thessalonians, this is God's will for you. Anybody want to know God's will for your life? No one wants to know God's will for their life. I kind of thought I'd get a hand or two on that one. If you want to know God's will for your life, 1 Thessalonians 4, chapter 4, verse 3 says, this is God's will for you. Your sanctification, which is just the word for the process of growing in holiness. And Paul says that's God's will, not for one or two people, but for the church, all of us. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 and 26. Paul tells the church in Ephesus, Jesus gave himself for his church to make her, you should be getting the idea by now, to make her holy. Not just to forgive her, to make her pure and holy, without wrinkle, without blemish. The integration of the Old Testament vision of holiness and the New Testament vision of holiness is captured in 1 Peter chapter 1, where Peter just plain quotes Leviticus and offers it to the church. You shall be holy, because the Lord your God is holy. So we sometimes recoil at the language of holiness, often because it's been misused. But the Bible offers us that same language as the norm of God's purposes for our lives. If you were to just ask the Bible, what's the normal life for the people of God? The answer comes back on every page. Holiness. Now, when we read Mark chapter 7, we discover the Pharisees don't share our problem. If we recoil at the language of holiness sometimes, or at least if we don't recoil, we maybe struggle to integrate it into our daily lives. I mean, who gets up, pours their coffee, and says, how will I be holy today? I mean, a few maybe, but in general, I don't think that's how we start our day. I don't think that's the orientation in general. How will I embody the character of a holy God today? So even if we don't recoil, we may not be doing that. The Pharisees don't share the problem, because these guys in Mark 7 take up the language of holiness and the language of purity and just grab hold of it with both hands and do all kinds of things with it. And they will let you know what it means to be pure and holy. And they will tell you, and they have definitions and expectations, even for Jesus, especially for Jesus. And that leads to a conflict in Mark chapter 7, a very public conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees and some teachers of the law. They were publicly trying to shame Jesus. Your disciples don't do what they're supposed to do. And anytime you call somebody out in public like that, you're trying to shame them publicly. Jesus doesn't back away because he has an opportunity to help the Pharisees and the disciples and all of us to rethink holiness, to reconsider the misperception and embrace the biblical way that holiness is framed, the way Jesus embodies it, the normal life for the people of God. And so in the middle of this conflict, where Jesus is going to set some things straight, the one thing that rises to the surface, the one thing that we need to take and embrace and hold on to, is that holiness is less about an appearance of piety and more about a posture of love. That's the issue, isn't it? The Pharisees, we'll see in just a minute, are obsessed with the appearance of piety. Notice I said the appearance of piety, not actual piety. Piety just means worship, reverence, true honoring of God. You'll want to be a person of piety. authentic piety. Just the appearance of piety, Jesus says that leaves you open to the charge of hypocrisy, which is where we don't want to be, is it? But that's the issue. The Pharisees lean into purity and holiness for the appearance of honoring God. Jesus, by the time we get through the end of this passage, will have shown us that it's less about that and more about a posture of love for God and neighbor, especially neighbors that other people don't love.